Summer's been over for a while now, and I'm really starting to feel that fall weather change, but I'd like to utilize my vegetable garden a little longer, so I'm going to build a cold frame. Now, a cold frame is kind of like a mini greenhouse that you set right on top of your growing beds. If you'll stick around, I'll show you how I do it. Now, I don't know if you can see it here, but I've got this piece of glass here, and that's going to be the lid of the cold frame. That's going to determine the size of the cold frame, because this is tempered. So I'm not going to be able to cut it. Now, the good thing about this tempered is it's very strong. Now, since I want to build it using only materials I have laying around the shop, either inside or outside, I'm going to start with a Doug Fir 2x12. Now, I know it seems really wasteful using a 2x12 for this, and Doug Fir is not decay resistant, but it's going to last long enough. It's getting pretty old, and I just want to use it up. Now, my first step is I want to rough cut it to length. By rough cut, I mean I'm going to cut it 3 or 4 inches longer than the finished pieces are eventually going to be. Now, this isn't going to be enough for all my long pieces. I do have another one outside I'm going to cut to the same length, and I'm also going to use this offcut piece here to rip the shorter pieces. I'll start by cutting out the 3-inch pieces. Now, I am going to need some shorter pieces, about 18 inches long, for the uprights going around the box. So I'll cut that out of whatever I don't need for the longer pieces. Now, if it was redwood or cedar, I wouldn't worry about painting it. But since it's Doug Fir, I am going to want to paint it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pre-paint all these pieces. And since it's kind of old and raggedy, I'm going to have to sand these sides here. Anything that hasn't been cut down to fresh wood, I'm going to sand it a little bit. I'm not going to sand it a lot. I'm not trying to make it pretty. All I want to do is make sure that paint sticks a little bit. I just want to get the weathered part of that wood off because the paint really won't stick to that very well. This should take paint really well. Oh, that looks pretty good. It's kind of an off-white color. Tomorrow I'll give it a good second coat, and then I'll be ready to start the real fun stuff. You know, I always buy the cheapest roller covers that I can find, because whenever I try and clean them, I can never get it clean enough. So as long as I'm in the middle of a project, whatever I'm painting with it, I just go ahead and bring it in. I want it to be a little wet. And I got a piece of painter's plastic here. I just lay it on that painter's plastic and roll it up. Then when I'm all done with my project, whatever it is, I can just grab it by the plastic, slide it off of the handle, and throw it away. All right, so this is all the wood pieces for the cold frame. Now, both the glass for the lid, or the top of the cold frame, and the plexiglass on the sides are going to fit into grooves that I'll cut into all these pieces. Now, I'm keeping these two stacks separate because the glass for the lid is a little thinner than the plexiglass for the box. And also, in the frame for the lid, I want to cut that groove 3/4 of an inch deep. But in the box, I'm only going to go a 1/2 inch because I want to just take advantage of the full size of my plexiglass. Now I'm going to start with the lid. So the first thing I have to do is lower that blade to 3/4 of an inch above the table. Now I can just eyeball that with my tape measure the way I did because it's really not a critical dimension. You'll see why later. And also, I have to determine just how far down from the top I want that groove to start. I'm thinking 5/16 of an inch. Now I always use a scrap piece to test on. That way if I'm not happy with the result, I haven't ruined anything. So first let's go ahead and set that fence to 5/16 of an inch and make a little test cut. Okay, that looks and feels right. I'm going to go ahead and make that first cut in the frame. So that's my first pass, and after every pass, even the first one, I'm going to go over to my glass and see if it fits. And that does not quite fit. So I'm just going to move the fence a little bit, run them through again, and see how they do. I think that's about right. Now the nice thing about cutting all these pieces out of those old 2x12s is this wood has gotten hard as a rock over time, and I think that will help us decay resistance a little bit. But since Doug fir is not really a decay resistant material, we're going to take some of this wood hardener. Now what it's really designed for is if you've got some dry rot in something, you kind of get away the real loose stuff and you soak this on it and it soaks into the dry rot and gets hard as a rock. So I think by putting it in here, it'll soak into the wood a little bit and it'll seal it up real nicely. Now I can't really just put regular paint in there because if I do that, it's going to be too thick a coating and the glass won't fit right. Alright, those are done. I'm going to set these aside, give that a chance to dry while I start putting the grooves in all of the material for the box. Now I've lowered the blade to just a ½ inch above the table and I moved my fence back to that 5/16 inch spacing. So I'll start with that and then move the fence away from the blade for successive cuts to make the groove wide enough to accommodate the plexiglass I'll be using. And as always, I'm starting with a scrap piece. That looks fine. I'll just go ahead and start running all these pieces through. Now I've just sorted through my whole stack here and I have it all laid out exactly in the way I want to run it through the blade. Now with the shorter pieces, these are the uprights. 4 of them are going to be corner pieces and each of the long sides of the cold frame is going to have 3 sections, so there'll be 2 posts along the way. I got to pay attention because the side posts are going to have a groove on opposite sides of the post, but the ones in the corner will have a groove on adjacent sides of the post. Alright, that's the first pass in all of them. I'm going to move my blade over. I should be able to move it a 1/16 of an inch. It is a narrow blade, but I think that'll do. So what I'll do is I'll run all these through again, move the saw just a little bit more, cut my test piece, recheck it, and see what's next. Alright, that's all the pieces 3 times through the blade. So the next step is to seal up these grooves just like I did with the parts for the lid or the top of the box. But before I do that, I'm going to take my scrap plexiglass and fit it into all the grooves. I'm going to slide it all the way along because I want to know it fits. Once I seal these, I don't want to have to run them through the saw again. So in this case, they do feel a little bit tight in places. Now, I'd rather have it be a little loose than a little tight because I don't want to have to pound this thing together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my blade over about a 30-second, push everything through again, then it'll be perfect. Okay, that's a lot better. That slides really easily now. All right, I think I got it. I'm going to go ahead and check all the rest of these, and then I can seal those up. All right, now I've sealed all the grooves in the pieces for the box, and the pieces for the lid that I did earlier are dry now. So I'm going to go ahead and get all these out of the way, then I can start assembling the lid. Now, anytime I'm moving the glass, I like to wear gloves. Even though it's a tempered safety glass and it breaks into the little pieces, they still have some kind of sharp edges on them. The big difference is they're not like going to slice an artery or something. And the first thing I'll do is I'll slip these end pieces onto the glass. Now I want to make sure they're in there nice and tight against the glass, so it's all the way in that groove. I'm tapping very carefully with a rubber mallet. So with those on there seated nice and tight, I can measure all the way to the outside of them. And then I can cut my long pieces a 1/16 of an inch longer than that measurement. I want just a little bit of play in there. Now I always like to just give one cut to clean up the end a little bit. Even though I have them freshly cut, there's some paint and things over the end like that. And so I can cut these two at the same time. And I'll tap these end pieces off. Always carefully and always with gloves on handling the glass. Now this glass is real flexible, it's kind of bendy here. So in order to make it a little easier to slide this edge piece on, bring it right over the edge of my workbench. Do the same over there. I want to make sure they're very snug to the glass when I measure them, and I'm going to add a 1/16 of an inch to give me that little bit of play in there. And as before, I'll clean up this first end. Okay, that looks just right. And that looks just right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and treat the end grain of these with that same wood hardener. All right, now with all those ends sealed, I can start assembling the frame right around the glass. Okay, first I'll just give myself a little room here. I got a lot of room there, it looks like. Just carefully tap this on. Get these corners nice and flush. The same at this end. Now in this case I got to move this short piece out a little bit because I left a little bit of room for play in there. Now don't worry about trying to center the glass in this thing. All you need to have is just that little bit of room there. It'll figure itself out. Now it's time to start fastening this frame together. Now I'm going to use these 3-inch trim head screws, and one of the things I like about them is the head on these is small enough that it shouldn't split the wood, and also it has this straight shaft on it, so that'll allow it to spin through this piece and pull that joint nice and tight together. I am going to pre-drill for these screws. The place I want to put it is way up in this upper corner here, and one big reason for that is I don't want to take a chance at hitting on the edge of the glass and shattering it, and we'll talk about the other reason later. There we go, nice and tight. Now we'll do the other 3 corners and then we'll move on to the next step. That's a good start, but even if I put a couple more screws in there, that's not a very strong joint. And since this is going to be a door, basically, a lid, it's going to be going up and down, and there's going to be a lot of stress on those joints. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill in there and put a dowel in there. I'm going to dowel these joints together with some glue. Now here's some place where I want to be real careful again, because if this touches the edge of the glass, it's done. I'm going to have to start all over. So when I look on the end grain here, you can see right there, that's part of the groove that the glass is in. So if I bend down and light up my drill bit, I can see that I'm going to come in just below that glass. In fact, I'm going to slant my drill ever so slightly downhill just to make sure I do not hit that glass. Okay, that went well, no broken glass. Same as before, I'll go around and drill the other 3 sides. Well, that looks great. The next thing I'll do is I'll take my compressor, I'll get some compressed air, I want to blow the dust out of those, I'll cut those dowels to length and I'll glue them in there. Let's cut some dowels. I've got this 1/2-inch dowel, so I'll mark them out at 3 inches. That's just slightly less my hole depth. And what I wanted was I'll be 1.5 inches through the side piece and 1.5 inches through the end piece. Now one more thing before I glue them in there. I want to put a little chamfer around one end of them. It's going to make it a lot easier to tap them in there. Now for any work you're doing that's going to be outside, you want to make sure and use a glue that says waterproof. They also have one that says water resistant, and they're both labeled exterior interior, but the water resistant is not going to last. You want it to be waterproof. So we'll put a little glue on the dowel. Doesn't take much because these are a pretty tight fit. I'm going to put a little glue in the hole as well, and we'll tap them in place and see how that goes. All right, that is a nice tight fit. These are not going to go anywhere. Okay, that's a dowel on all 4 corners. Now I want to go around and get one more screw in each corner. I want those joints to be as strong as possible. Now the reason I didn't put this last screw in before is I wanted to get that dowel in there. I was afraid the screw might be in the way of my drill bit, and I don't want to be hitting any screws with my drill bit. There we go, and the lid is done. That means it's finally time to start the box. But before I pull the lid off the workbench, I want to get some measurements, because the shorter end pieces on the box are going to be the same length as these shorter end pieces here on the lid. But since we're going to have a post in each corner, and these posts are going to go all the way to the bottom, and the framing is going to butt up against it, the longer pieces are going to be measured from the inside here. So I'm going to take all these measurements and write them down. Then I can move this out of the way and start cutting down to the material. All right, looks good. Now, just like I did for the lid, I want to get a fresh cut on one end, and I'll measure from there for the finished length. All right, everything cut to length, but I'm not ready to start assembling it yet. Now my cold frame is long enough that I can't span the whole distance here. I'm going to need some kind of a post. Now ordinarily, I'd put one post right in the middle, but since the plexiglass I'm using is left over from other projects, all I've got is two 28-inch pieces and a bunch of 24-inch pieces. Well, a 28 and two 24s is just long enough to make the span here, but what I'm going to have to do is have two posts along the way. So the first thing I got to do is find the center and measure out 28 inches each direction. So then it's 28 inches, so I'll put 14 right on that mark. Get a mark there, get a mark there. Now I just want to square them across so I know exactly what I'm looking at. Now what I've done here is just by kind of sighting on the end, it'll be close enough. I made a line on the face here that matches up with the bottom of the groove there. So what I'll do is I'll set this on here, and then I will set this one on here. The way I'm going to fasten these is I'm going to make a lap joint. So I'm going to make kind of a tenon on these pieces, and sort of a big wide groove on the lower pieces. The first thing I have to do with this line lined up is get a mark on each side of this post. I'll do the same over here. And just like before, I'll square them up. Now here's where it gets a little tricky, because you're starting to get a lot of marks here. So what I'm going to do is on each piece, I'm going to put an X. I'm going from there to there, and from there to there. That way there's no confusion later on when I'm going to make my cuts. Now next, I got to transfer the marks I made up here to the side that's going to be cut away. Now this is the bottom piece here. It's going to sit down in the garden, and that's the top piece. The lid's going to sit on top of that. So now the part I want to cut away is this part back here that's away from the groove. So I'm going to have to lay that side down, and the same with that top rail. I'll line up these ends carefully. So now there's the lines I made. And now I'm glad to have that X in there, because there's 3 lines there and I want to make sure and get the right pair. Go like that. And I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to make an X right inside there. That way there just can be no confusion. We'll do the same at this end. X, and X. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a notch in each of the post locations on both the top and the bottom rail of the two long sides. And we're going to go a 1/2 inch deep on this notch. And what I'm going to do is I'll cut a notch out of the side of this, and I'll notch the end of each end of each post to fit that. So I'm going to basically make a lap joint where that notch in the post fits right into the notch here. And I'll explain later why I'm only going a 1/2 inch here and not halfway through the material. Now the first thing I want to do is get my blade right to a 1/2 inch. Now this is not a real critical measurement. I can get close enough just by eyeballing one of the teeth on my tape measure here. And there we go. Now that'll be fine. I'm still going to make a test cut in the scrap piece. See that? It looked good on my tape, but I'm about a 1/16 shy, so I'm going to crank it up just a little bit and try it again. And that time is perfect. Let's see how we do. And now that I have both sides of that notch defined with the saw cuts, I'm going to go ahead and make a series of cuts just a little ways apart all the way through the middle of that notch. When I have all of them cut like that, I'll take it over to the workbench, I'll chisel that out, and then I'll start working on the notches at the end of the posts. Well, that looks really nice. So these notches came out pretty nice, but they are just a little rough in there. So I'm going to take my wood rasp, that's kind of like a file for wood, and I'm just going to smooth that out a little bit. It's not going to take a whole lot because this takes off material pretty quick. Alright, I'll go ahead and finish up all these other notches, and the next thing I'm going to have to do is rip my plexiglass to height, because that'll tell me how tall these posts are going to have to be. Alright, so I brought all my scraps of plexiglass over, though actually when I was buying it originally, the guy at the hardware store corrected me and said this is acrylic, which I really just used the term plexiglass kind of generically. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and cut all these pieces out, then I can move on back to the frame. Now these cut edges here are a little bit ragged. It's very sharp on this side, and on the other side it has kind of like a little lip that sticks up in places because it tends to get a little melty when you cut this stuff. So what I want to do is smooth it out just a little bit, put the slightest of chamfers on each side because I want this thing to go together real easily. It's also pretty chipped up along the edge, but all of that's going to be hidden inside the groove, so I'm just not going to worry about it. That's really all it's going to take for each piece. Now in order to determine the height of the frame, which will determine the height of the post, I'll take a piece of the plexiglass, slip it into the bottom frame, and set one of the short top frames on top of it. And I'll get that measurement, which in my case here is about 13.5 inches. Now with the glass, I only added a 1/16 of an inch of space around it, partly because I didn't want that glass flopping around as I open and shut the door. But this plastic could expand quite a bit when the sun hits it and it gets hot. So I'm going to go ahead and leave a full 1/8 of an inch for this. So my measurement is 13.5. I'm going to cut my post to 13 5/8. Now when I cut the posts, I'm going to start the same way I started every other cut I made. I'm going to start by cleaning up one end, but since I have 8 of them to cut identical, I put a stop block here on my table. That way I can be sure that every single one is exactly the same height. 7 more times that I got it. Now I'm going to cut the notches in the top and bottom of the intermediate post a little differently. Rather than just nibbling my way all the way through it, I'm going to go ahead and set my blade to about 1 inch, and then I'll make a cross cut right at the extent of the notch. Then I'll bring the fence over and I'll just go ahead and rip it on both sides to get it the right thickness. I'll show you what I mean, it'll make sense. Now since all this material is exactly the same thickness, I can get a starting point for my blade height by setting it to just the height of the material that's left over after these notches were cut. So we'll go ahead and start with that, and I'll make my cross cut, then I'll turn it over and I'll rip it to get the thickness right. Now with that cross cut done, I'm going to get the fence out of my way. I'm going to run my blade up nice and high. I want to get it up pretty much as high as it'll go. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Sharpie and my square and mark right there, right where the blade goes through the edge of the table. So I go right to stop my cut. And I'll take my test piece, then I'll set my fence right at 1/2 inch, and I'll start with that and see how it goes. So what I did now was I went ahead and pushed this through until my termination cut reached that line of the table. I can test it right here in the notch I cut earlier in the rails. And that feels about right, and that is with my fence set right at exactly 1/2 inch. So that's very repeatable. The next thing I'll do is I'll use this as a gauge to lower the blade for making these termination cuts. The most dependable way I have of making sure I'm cutting the right part off of this is to go ahead and set it in place and match up the grooves. Now I know this height has to stay because it's going to slide down into that slot. I'm going to put an X over on that side there. I'm going to start with the 1.5 inch cut and do the 3 inch later. That way, just in case I did something wrong, I can always turn these into the 3 inch cut. Now by putting my square right on the mark I made earlier, I can go ahead and run this blade up until it's in exactly the same place and make those other cuts. And again, this time I can set my fence to 1/2 inch. There we go. Now we'll finish up the other end of these, and then it'll be time to start putting it together. Even though it'd be a lot more fun to start the assembly, I know the right thing to do is take my same wood hardener and seal up all the notches and all the end cuts I made. All right, after all the cutting and grooving and painting, it's finally time to put the boxes together. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the same 3 inch trim head screws I used on the lid. I can't put the top piece on yet because I've got to slip the plexiglass in first. And I want to get the whole frame assembled and just cut all the plexiglass at one time. And that's number 2. I'm going to be using these 1.25 inch exterior flathead screws to assemble the sides. One of the things I like about it has a little straight shaft here that'll allow it to spin through this 1/2 inch thickness while it bites into the 1 inch thickness here, and it'll pull that joint nice and tight. Now what I don't like is on the underside of the head there, it's tapered in like this. So if I just pre-drill and put that screw in, it's going to split the end of the board. For these, I'm going to have to countersink them. Put the countersink bit in this other drill, so let's go ahead and get started. square that up. Now the other one. And that is number 2. Now I can put all these together, cut the plexiglass to length, and slip it in, put the top rails on, then we're almost done. I'll be using the 3-inch trim head screws again. Now as you can see, the corner posts go all the way down to my workbench here. It'll be all the way down to the ground. And what that does is I'm screwing it on the end of this 3-inch piece, so that gives me quite a bit of strength laterally. All right, that's our basic shape. Now the plexiglass. Now all my grooves are a 1/2 inch deep, and I want to leave an 1/8 inch clearance all the way around for expansion. So I will take this measurement and add 7/8 of an inch to it. Beautiful. I'll just keep going all the way around. Beautiful. Now these ends are going to be a little bit different because I didn't have any plexiglass scraps long enough to go the distance here. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this one in here, cut one to fit on this side. I'm going to join them with some silicone seal. I don't know if that's going to work, if it's really going to hold in the long run, but it really doesn't matter. I think it's going to be fine. Now we'll just run a little bead of silicone seal along this edge. I really don't need much because the joint's going to be tight together. Now I do have a little squeeze out there, but I think I'm just going to wait and trim that off afterward. We are really getting there now. Now we'll just get some screws in these 4 intermediate posts, and then it'll be time to set the lid up on top and see how it looks. Now even with that countersink, I want to be careful because if I drive these in a little too much, I can still split that wood. All right, let's see how it looks with the lid on. Well, that looks great. Now let me see if I have some hinges for this. Well, I was able to find some hinges in my box of old hardware stuff. I've got a pair of hinges here still in the pack, but it's clearly been around a while. The pack's pretty raggedy. And this is just one single one floating around. But that's okay because I'm not going to use the screws that came with them. Now these hinges are a little small, but the package says they're rated for 40 pounds for a pair. And I don't think that even weighs 40 pounds. But anyway, I'm going to use these same 1¼ inch screws that I use for fastening these posts on, because I want those hinges to be on there strong. And the real failure point is the screw, I think, more than the hinge itself. So I've got 3 of them. This is the oddball. So I'll put it right in the center. I already have the center marked. The most important thing is the screws are below the level of my glass, because if I hit the edge of that glass, all this is for nothing. And something else to watch out for, although it probably doesn't matter, is these screws here are above the level of the top of the plexiglass on the sides. Now over here, I've already measured 6 inches in from the end. It doesn't really matter that much where it is. That just looked right to me, so that's what I went with. All right, got the hinges on, now the handle. Now, as I said at the outset, my goal was to build the entire cold frame using only stuff I have in and around the shop. Now, I was lucky enough to find 3 hinges, but I didn't have a decent handle to lift it up with. The best I could do is I had a bunch of these. Now, this backing plate here is way too big for me to use. So what I did was I took my grinder and I made a couple cuts, and I was able to get the handle piece off of the other one. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to screw in a couple of these eye bolts and just thread that through. Now once I have them in there, it'll go through the first one okay, but I'm not going to be able to hook it into the second one. So I'll just take my channel locks here and bend that open just enough to fit over there. I've already laid it out, found my center here. We'll screw these guys in. I'll go ahead, hook that through the first eye bolt, send it through there, and just bend this back. And there we go. Now I got to find a way to keep this open in the daytime, so I cut a couple of pieces 3/4 of an inch thick, and I'm going to mount them on the outside here. Now I've got these 1/4 inch carriage bolts I'm going to use, and kind of a fender washer here. Now it's one size too big for the bolt, so the little square part of that carriage bolt fits right inside that washer. I'm going to put that through the end of this, get my hole drilled, and then mount it onto this permanently. Now at the top I'm going to use a regular flat washer and a lock nut, because I'm concerned that over time of moving it back and forth, it's going to loosen up there. Now I don't want that too tight, just a bit snug. At the bottom of the support here, I'm going to use a shorter carriage bolt. I'm going to bolt it through here, then I'll drill a hole inside the frame, and I'll stick that in there to support the top. I'm going to take a drill bit that's just the same size as the washer I'm going to use, and I'm going to drill in here just far enough so that the nut and the washer will be flush with this surface. Whenever you're doing this, you always want to drill this clearance hole first, because it's a lot easier to run my 1/4 inch drill through the center of that than to try and center that over an existing 1/4 inch hole. And I want my bolt to be really snug in this hole. Normally I drill slightly oversized for putting a bolt through, but I want this really snug, so I'm using a 1/4 inch hole for a 1/4 inch bolt. Now this one does not need to be a lock nut, because I'm going to cinch that down really good and tight. Open this up just a little further. I'll just use this to mark that hole. Now I do want to make this hole slightly oversized. I don't want it too big. I'm going to go ahead and drill a 3/8 of an inch for a 1/4 inch bolt, because I do want this to go in there fairly easily. And when there's weight on there, I don't think it's just going to pop out. Okay, that's holding pretty well. And that's only one of them in there. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So now the last thing I need to do to finish this side up is trim the end of this support about 3/4 of an inch or so beyond the bolt. That's going to be perfect. Now this is going to be too hard for me to carry out to the garden by myself, so I'm going to take the lid off, carry that out separately, and I'll just screw it back on once I get it in place. Now I got to be a little careful here because I do have a couple little things growing and they're just poking out that big. I don't want to crush them. There we go, now it's time to plant. It's about a month later and I've got the cold frame open because even though they are growing inside the cold frame here, my nights are getting down into the mid to low 30s. So I can still only grow cool weather crops. And if I let it get too hot in there for too many days, they're gonna bolt, which means they're just gonna go right to seed. They won't be good to me anymore. But if you look in here, the smaller plants you see, I planted from seed in the mild weather before I got the cold frame out here. And the larger ones, I planted more recently from starts that I got at the nursery. Now what I do, right near the end of the day, I come out and close up the cold frame while there's still a little bit of sun left to warm that soil before the air really starts to get cold. For anybody still around at the end of this very long video, thank you for watching and thanks for sticking around this long. If you enjoyed the content, is it all helpful to you, give me a like and a subscribe. It really does help out the channel. And please leave any comments or suggestions you have below. I would love to hear what you're thinking.